Good evening, everybody. My name is Leyla Hannbeck, and I'm Director of Pharmacy at the MPA. I have to say, really sorry for the delay on going live. We've had some technological issues, unfortunately, and Simon Wills, my colleague, has been working really hard behind the scenes to try and make sure that the platform is operating. So really sincere apologies about the delay. I'm joined here tonight by Garry Myers, a pharmacy contractor and PSNC funding and contract subcommittee representative, and Harpreet, Chana, program director at the MPA and former PSNC head of pricing. So tonight we are going to cover the first webinar in a series of webinars on community pharmacy funding. The reason for that is because in recent months, the MPA has received many inquiries from contractors about funding and financial matters. And this has basically prompted us to start these webinars to discuss community pharmacy funding and how it impacts on your bottom line as contractors. The topics that we're going to be covering in this series include margin delivery, drug tariff, price setting, price concessions, and business support. So alongside these webinars, the series of webinars that we're going to be carrying out over the coming months, we will also be producing updated resources for pharmacy teams, including short training videos, and this will create basically a menu of resources for you to pick and choose from depending on your existing knowledge of funding. So this series is designed really to help all members and hopefully bring everybody up to the same level of funding knowledge. So without further ado, I am going to hand over to Garry and Harpreet to take you through their presentation. Over to you, Garry and Harpreet.
Thank you, Leyla. Good evening, everybody. Before we start on the meat of the presentation, we just wanted to go through some aims and objectives of what we wanted you to take away from this webinar. So by the end of this one, which is the first of the series, hopefully you should have a good understanding of the global sum and how it's distributed through remuneration, reimbursement, and margin, how delivery of that margin is monitored and delivered through the adjustment mechanisms, and really what that means practically in your businesses, i.e. how does that affect your cash flow, and when should you be looking for that impact to hit. So before we start, what I wanted to do, just take you through some basics of community pharmacy funding, and really this is split into three core components, as you can see here. If we start over on the left in the blue circle, what we've got here is drugs reimbursement. So this is the total drugs spend, and this is what comes out of the CCG's budget. So this is reimbursement for the prices that you have paid for your drugs. It also includes a few other elements of payment. So if you have a look there, it's the cost of the drugs and appliances, as we've said, the container payment, which is your 10p payment for split packs, the consumables allowance, and also your out-of-pocket expenses. So these are the things that are associated with reimbursement and come from your CCG's budget. Over on the right-hand side, in the kind of pinky purple box, you've got remuneration. And now this is the figure that we hear the most about when we talk about community pharmacy funding. For the purposes of this presentation, we have assumed that the funding for the whole of 2018-19 will be 2.592 billion, just for illustrative purposes. And as I said, this is the figure that we hear about when we hear about negotiating funding, total funding pot, global sum. That's this figure here, and actually this is paid by NHS England, who hold the purse strings for remuneration. And it's given out in fees and allowances, so the single activity fee, your CD fees, methadone fees, the advanced services, so your MURs, NMS, also your quality payments, that all comes from the remuneration element of the budget. So in the middle, and the reason why we have it straddling both reimbursement and remuneration is because it kind of affects both. So in the middle we have retained buying margin. So this is £800 million worth of margin that community pharmacy is allowed to earn for procuring medicines effectively on behalf of the NHS. And the reason it straddles is because it does come out of the remuneration element of funding. So it's part of the 2.592 billion. However, it's paid through reimbursement. So you don't see this anywhere. It's not, captured in your statement that you get. It doesn't say anywhere that you've made this much margin. It's rolled up into your total reimbursement for the product that you've given out, and is but it does form part of that remuneration element of funding. So a little bit aside to that, and we wanted to keep this separate for you so you could see that whilst flu and NUMSAS do form part of funding as well, they actually come from two separate pots. So flu and the flu service, remuneration for that comes from the NHS vaccinations budget, and NUMSAS, remuneration for that comes from the Pharmacy Integration Fund. So whilst they do still form part of community pharmacy funding, they're not incorporated within those three core elements. So I'm going to pass over to Garry to take us through Category M price setting and how that impacts our cash flow and funding.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks, Harpreet. Right, you can see this slide here that talks about category and price setting. Before I do that, I think there's one point I just wanted to make about the discussion that Harpreet's just given on slide 5. I think it's important to understand right from the outset that the 2.592 billion, which includes the 800 million of retained margin, effectively is fixed. And it's fixed following discussions and negotiations with PSNC. Obviously, that's an agreed amount that the government agrees to pay for the community pharmacy service in England. And that amount effectively is fixed once the agreement's reached with the department, largely irrespective of the amount of margin that we actually earn and the fees and allowances we actually earn. So I think it's important to understand that your adjustments, which we'll talk about later, arise as a result of the global sum itself largely being an estimate. So when the actual figures are known under the adjustment mechanisms, then changes have to be made in year to ensure that we don't under or overshoot the amount of money that's shown in the global sum. Now, one of the main mechanisms whereby the department effectively control margin delivery to community pharmacies is through the Category M mechanism. And as you can see from the slide there, each price in drug tariff category M, the reimbursement price, which community pharmacies are paid, is a price that's effectively established or determined by reference to factory gate prices. So what the department does is, using a closely guarded formula, they take the factory gate price data that they get under Scheme M from manufacturers and effectively add on an allowed margin. Now, the allowed margin, as it says here, includes wholesaler margin. So obviously, if there are any changes to wholesale margin or pharmacy margin, then that can actually impact on actual margin delivered to individual contractors. Prices are set with regard to Category M prices in advance. So this is an estimate that the department sets to allow us to actually fix the prices in the tariff. It isn't the actual margin that's delivered. The actual margin delivered is determined later retrospectively using the margin survey. However, it is the case that if there are rapidly rising prices in the marketplace, either at factory gate or wholesaler pricing levels, then that can create a lag before the pricing mechanism in Category M actually catches up. It can be up to 3 to 6 months in arrears. So contractors very often complain that wholesalers have actually increased the price of the medicines that they're actually buying, and therefore they're not actually collecting the requisite amount of margin. And at some point later down the line, the drug tariff price setting mechanism in theory catches up with that and corrects the issue. But it does create a lag which can actually squeeze pharmacy margins in the shorter term until the price setting mechanism under Category M catches up. And the other important issue to note here is that the Category M price setting mechanism also works by reference to estimated volumes of drugs that we're actually going to dispense. And obviously, if actual volumes differ from that, then again, that can affect the amount of margin actually delivered. As I said earlier, the adjustment mechanism that we actually apply later, following what we call the margin survey outturn, allows us to actually vary the total amount of margin. So historically, where contractors have tended to earn more margin, and the margin obviously been determined by the margin survey, then it is necessary to make an adjustment in order to ensure that contractors still earn the requisite 800 million in margin. Next slide. Okay, so just a word about buying margin. I mean, this is obviously misunderstood by the wider NHS, but essentially purchase margin, or buying margin as we call it, i.e. the difference between what the NHS reimburses under the tariff and our actual procurement costs, obviously amounts to a purchasing incentive. And the idea of this mechanism is to incentivize pharmacies to drive down prices to the benefit of the NHS. And how this works is, as the department very often tell us, they like community pharmacies to have a price to beat, as they call it, which effectively is a tariff reimbursement price, because obviously as individual contractors, you do know that if you actually beat the price in the tariff, you are actually therefore earning margin. And the department can therefore use that mechanism, that purchasing incentive, to encourage pharmacies to buy at the cheapest possible price. It then knows that obviously through the adjustment mechanism and the margin survey that works retrospectively, any excess margin that pharmacies earn above and beyond that 800 million can subsequently be recovered by subsequent adjustments to the amount of margin delivered in subsequent years, what some people sometimes call a clawback. However, in recent months and years, this has become a problem. And that is because the relationship between community pharmacies and wholesalers may well have started to change. Why has that become a problem? Well, as you can see from this slide, the price floor, which results in generics manufacturers actually pulling out of certain markets, can arise in a global commodity market where the price in a particular jurisdiction is being driven too low. Now, it could be the case, and some people think this may have happened to a certain extent in the UK market, where we've got some of the cheapest generics around. As a manufacturer manufacturing in foreign countries, you may decide that the prices in the UK market are not cheap enough for you. So you may start to reduce the amount of supply into the UK market. That therefore means the relationship between the seller and the buyer changes, and as everyone knows under supply and demand economics, that can then mean that the power actually shifts from the buyer to the seller, since you're actually dealing in a global commodity which is in short supply. In terms of divestments of branded products, the NHS has also had a problem there with the divestment of certain brands into generics. And that's because the price setting mechanisms in generics historically have always been set using market forces of the type I've just described. So if you're a manufacturer of a particular branded product, what you can do is divest it and turn it into a brand, in which case that product is covered by the controls in the generics market as a result of generic market forces, as I've just described, as opposed to the PPRS mechanism, which currently controls the pricing of branded medicines. So it allows a manufacturer, especially when there's no competition for that product, to actually increase the prices dramatically when they divest it from a brand to a generic. Also, pharmacies are resource starved at the moment due to the baseline funding cuts, and we do know of contractors that are struggling. And it's therefore sometimes the case that efficient procurement can not be seen as a priority due to the strain being placed on community pharmacies. Effective procurement requires a lot of time, effort, and resource actually being spent looking around, shopping around, trying to actually procure at the cheapest possible price. And we know that some pharmacy owners may well have been struggling with that. The last point here is another area that causes a lot of concern within the current system. Obviously, CCGs are under huge budgetary pressure like the rest of the NHSs, and they're constantly looking for opportunities to reduce their prescribing costs. And that's resulted in a lot of cases of local prescribing variations where CCGs may try to reduce the cost of their prescribing, and that can actually distort the amount of margin delivered to contractors in different CCGs. Now, for independent contractors and NPA members, where you may have pharmacies that are concentrated in a particular CCG, that can mean effectively that you don't quite get your fair share of the margin cake, as we call it. Obviously, the distortion between different community pharmacies can heap additional financial strain on individual contractors. Next slide.
Okay, thanks, Gary. So we've heard a little bit about how Category M prices are set and why community pharmacy is allowed to earn this 800 million in margin. And one of the most important components of margin delivery is actually monitoring how much margin community pharmacy has made throughout the year. And it's the Department of Health and Social Care that actually monitor this. And they do that through conducting a margin survey every month. And what that consists of is effectively 20 independent contractors, and it is independents only, who have their invoices selected at random, and they are sent to the NHS Business Services Authority, the BSA. And then the department also randomly selects roughly about 300 products to routinely monitor for margin earned. And these products are a mixture of branded products, generic products, specials. So it really is a wide variation of products. All transactions that relate to these products from those invoices are then input by the BSA onto a database. PSNC then performs a complete mirror survey, so they do exactly the same thing and will input the transactions that they find onto their database, and the results are then compared with all discrepancies. Oh, wonderful. Sorry. See, at least you know that this is live. We've had some real technical problems tonight. I must apologise. So I've come back and what we were saying. So, yes, PSNC performs the mirror survey. The results are compared and any discrepancies are accounted for. Data cleansing is then carried out by both PSNC and the department to ensure that the purchase prices that they use for monitoring margin delivery are absolutely accurate. So some of the specific issues that are covered as part of this monitoring of margin is that there is a full scrutiny of discounts applied by the department from the wholesaler statements. This is PSNC that does this, and they do that so that the purchase price is the most accurate that it can be, and it's to ensure that the prices that they use are an accurate representation of exactly what has been paid for these products. There's also a particular process that's used to account for price concessions. So any products that have been granted price concessions throughout the year are accounted for separately. And this is why it's so important that when you are reporting price concession issues or products that you can't procure at the drug tariff price to PSNC, that it is the actual price that you are having to pay for the items and not necessarily the highest price that's being offered to you. And the reason for that is any distortions to those purchase prices, even if price concession lines, will be picked up by this survey. So it is important that you do use the most accurate price that you can. They also do a particular monitoring of a brand or special price where the generic has not been available for whatever reason in the market and you've had to procure a brand or special instead. So that's also taken into account. And then low spend surcharges are also captured and the impact to margin is captured within this survey. And it can take PSNC and the department a really long time to agree the final figure of margin. As you can see, it's quite a complex process, lots of things to take into account. So it can take quite a bit of time for that final agreement, as Garry will attest to with his time, being with PSNC, that there are quite a lot of discussions. And I'm just going to hand over to him to just pick up a little bit about that and the adjustment mechanisms.
Okay, so as you can see from there, the numerous discussions take place to agree a final figure of margin and obviously are actually quite complex. Once the final answers are agreed between the DH and PSNC, they're used to inform negotiations for contractual framework funding. And the surveys are monitored quarterly with a final settlement for the previous financial year, usually being decided in the autumn of year 2. So, for example, this year, at the end of this month, March of 2019, will be the end of the margin year for the 18-19 period, and it's likely that we won't actually get a final figure for margin delivered for this particular financial year until sometime in the autumn. And very often contractors will tell you, will remember that very often that results in adjustments to category and margin around about October time. Next slide. Okay, so what do we do? How does DHSC, NHS ensure that funding is delivered? Obviously, we have the margin adjustments, and we monitor margin on a quarterly basis, okay? And we actually, using the margin for the previous year, so when we've actually started to get margin data for the 18-19 period, we can then use that to try to estimate what we think margin is going to look like in 19-20. It's what we call the run rate, and it gives us an idea as to what the margin trend looks like. Now, obviously, there are two types of adjustments that can take place once we've actually got the margin figures. The first is we can make a retrospective adjustment in respect of any under delivery of margin based on the actual margin survey figures. So if, for example, the margin survey figures for 18-19 were to show an over delivery of margin against the target of 800 million, shall we say, then that would mean that there would have to be a retrospective adjustment in order to correct for that over delivery of margin in the 18-19 period. At the same time, in that same period, it appears from the margin survey data for 18-19 that the run rate for 19-20 is too high. Then it may also be the case that NHS England would wish to see an in-year adjustment of or what we call a prospective margin adjustment to try to ensure that margin delivery for 19-20 comes as close as possible to target. So obviously, at the same time, what we also need to be aware of under this is that it can actually go the other way. If there is an under delivery of margin, then that can actually result in one of two things. It can actually result in a price increase to category M to put extra margin back into the system to correct for the under delivery, or in some instances, and there was a case like this a few years ago, where we had a one-off special determination in the drug tariff in order to pay contractors a lump sum of fees as opposed to margin in order to correct for an underpayment. As I say, adjustments can be retrospective or prospective, and any adjustments of this type are designed to ensure that only the agreed amount of margin is delivered, not a penny more, not a penny less. Likewise, it is also the case that remuneration is affected in the same way, and we will see in-year adjustments to single activity fees based on whether prescription volume is on target based on the agreed amount of fees and allowances, or below, or above or below. And so if, for example, we were to see a reduction in prescription volume over the ensuing period, that might mean that we need to increase the single activity fee in order to ensure that the requisite amount of funding is delivered to contractors. So I think it's important for people to understand this is how the global sum works. And it goes some way towards dispelling the myth that somehow pharmacy contractors at a national level can rip off taxpayers, because these mechanisms ensure that contractors only get the agreed amount of funding that's been agreed between PSNC and the department. And therefore, any suggestion that contractors could actually inflate margin or inflate fees and allowances to the detriment of taxpayers is simply not true. Next slide. Okay. Harpreet?
Thanks, Gary. So before we start talking about the impact of adjustment mechanisms to cash flow and what that actually means practically, we just wanted to take the opportunity to recap on the payment timetable. It can be a little bit complex to try and keep ahead of when you're being paid for what. So we just wanted to give the basic outline in this, obviously, first webinar, and then we can overlay on the top of that with some of the other more complex information. So taking it as an example, so if you are dispensing in this first month, so the dispensing month is month 1, and at the end of that month, you bundle up all your prescriptions, you made sure all your EPS has been submitted, you send it to the BSA, and by the 5th of month 2, those prescriptions are received by the BSA. They start the processing of the payments, and what you'll get by the 1st of the 3rd month is that you'll get your advance paid for month 1, and the advance is calculated based on the items that you have declared on your FP34C submission document for month 1, multiplied by the average item value, that's the AIV, from month 0, so that's the preceding month. And effectively, the BSA will just take the items as you've declared. They'll just take that raw figure from the month before, and they will calculate an advance payment that they will then make to you for month 1. By the 1st of month 4, what you will then get is the balancing payment, and now this is the actual amount that you have been, reimbursed for month 1 minus the advance that's already been paid for month 1, and that's really important to try and understand that this can be a positive or a negative. And the reason for that is because you've had an advance calculated based on the AIV of the previous month. If for whatever reason you've had an inflated AIV in the previous month, or there's been a price change of any kind, that can really impact the amount of the balancing payment. Once you've had the advance taken away from that balancing payment, it can be a positive or negative amount. You will also be paid an advance for month 2 in that payment. And what you will actually get and what will actually hit your account is a net effect of the balancing payment for month 1 and the advance for month 2. And so sometimes what we get is members saying, well, my net payment isn't what I thought it would be. It doesn't match my wholesaler bills. And actually, the figure that you want to be using for comparative purposes is the total for that month, rather than the net that's hitting your account, because as you can see, the net figure is the balancing payment minus the advance payment for the next month. So really, it's the total amount authorised by PPD that shows up on your FP34 statement. That's the figure you want to be comparing to your wholesaler bills for that month to get a real picture of how much you've been reimbursed versus how much you've actually paid out. So looking at that payment timetable and what happens to cash flow if there is an adjustment mechanism, we've used an example of a CAT-M price reduction being imposed in January 2019. So that's our example there. So what would happen on the 1st of January is that, as Gary mentioned, the prices for CAT-M are set using data from 6 months ago, and they will be then also a CAT-M reduction on that price. So it will be the price is set minus a CAT-M reduction, and this should really reflect in the buying prices that you are being quoted in the month of January. However, as Gary did mention, there is a lag between the buying prices catching up to the reduced CAT-M prices in the tariff, and this really is where community pharmacy has to use those negotiation skills, and I will defer to Gary to start going into some of what those skills are needed and what to do in that month where those buying prices might not be reflective of the reduced CAT-M prices.
Okay, so if we just move further along the timeline to the next month, using the example just quoted by Harpreet, as you can see from that, what you actually receive on the 1st of March is your balancing payment for December, And bear in mind that any balancing payment can either be positive or negative, plus the advance payment for January 19. But it's important for everybody to try to understand this. That advance payment for January 19 is based on the items declared for January multiplied by the AIV for the previous month of December. Okay, and as we both know, if there's been a price reduction in category M in January 19, that advance payment is likely to be an overpayment, because we know the AIV in January has gone down as a result of a category M adjustment. So obviously at the moment on that cash flow side of things, there's no impact, because you aren't in this scenario actually feeling the full impact of the reduction in prices implemented in January. The real impact comes through in the following month. So if we move to the next month, this is where things get really interesting. So can we move to the next, move along the timeline, please? Right, so now on the 1st of April, then we've actually got the balancing payment for January 19, and this is likely to be negative for the reasons I've just described, because the advance payment for January was based on the December item value, and the balancing payment for January is based on the actual item value. And obviously, if the advance in the first instance was too high, then the actual balancing payment is likely to be a negative figure. And then you add that balancing payment to the advance payment for February. And the February advance payment is based on items declared for February times the AIV for January. Now, February is always a short month, lower activity, and therefore lower volume. And so the number of items you're multiplying by there is obviously lower than average. So on the one hand, you've actually got a negative adjustment to your balancing payment, and at the same time, you've actually got reduced item volume in February. And this is what we call a double hit. I think it's also worth mentioning that this impact creates the peaks and troughs that we sometimes see in contractor cash flows. Because if there is a reduction in the item value from, say, December to January, the net impact of that on the 1st of April isn't a reduction of, say, 10p an item, it doubles the impact, because your advance payment is based on the advance payment is actually based on January, and the previous advance was based on December, and so what we end up with is an effect that doubles the impact in terms of its impact on cash flow. If you move further along to the next month on the 1st of May, at that point the balancing payment for February is paid. Now, the balancing payment for February obviously is the difference between the actual payment for February based on the prescriptions that have been priced by then, less the advance payment for February. Now, in this particular scenario, by that point, you've taken out some of the overpayment that happened in the previous month, and therefore, what you would notice is that the balancing payment would actually be better than it was the previous month, because the adjustment's taken place. In addition to that, you would receive an advance payment for March, which is based on your items declared for March multiplied by the AIV for February. And obviously, that would then be a better payment than was the previous month. So what this mechanism shows you is the importance of contractors understanding the payment system and understanding how it impacts their cash flow. Experience tells me banks don't like surprises, and they will have more confidence in contractors, and you will have a better opportunity to ensure that you've got appropriate credit terms if you can demonstrate to your banks and your financial backers that you understand this mechanism and have actually made appropriate provision for being able to cope with these peaks and troughs. Okay, that concludes what I've actually got to say for now. Obviously, I can take questions later. I think we're now going to hand over to Leyla to complete the roundup. Leyla?
Thank you, Garry, and thank you, Harpreet. Everyone, I hope you found the presentation delivered by Harpreet and Garry useful. We've got a number of questions that have come through, and I'm going to be putting these questions to Garry and Harpreet to answer. But before I do that, I just wanted to let you know that our next webinars will cover the following topics. For example, why am I not making enough margin, understanding your margin delivery, understanding shortages and how to maximize procurement, endorsing and best practice, how how revenue protection can affect your bottom line, running a successful pharmacy business, hearing it from actual financial experts, and how could funding models change, what would be the impact, and also understanding Scottish community pharmacy funding. And these are going to be spread over, months from April to November. And we will be communicating it with you in terms of when the dates will be. I'm sorry again for the technical issues that we experienced today. And just to let you know as well that all of these slides will be available on the MPA website. And we will also be responding to the questions that come through if we can't handle them today, or if we don't have time to do that today. So the first question that I'm going to ask Garry and Harpreet is in relation to one of our audience members has written. So if you have surgeries that use a lot of branded generics, would you miss out on the margin that you should be getting?
Yes, you will. It's one of the issues that we've had in discussions we've had with the Department of Health for some time. There were certain mechanisms that the department is intending to look at in order to try and mitigate the impact of this, using techniques such as splitting the clawback discount scale and what have you. And these were issues that were identified, I think, in a parliamentary answer that was given by Steve Brine recently. And there were also items that were identified in the original funding imposition. Obviously, in recent months, we think the problems become more acute as the downward pressure on CCG budgets has become more acute. And so CCGs are now looking also at all sorts of mechanisms, not just branded generic prescribing, but also trying to introduce what they call direct supply arrangements, such as with dressings and things like that, and also de-prescribing initiatives. De-prescribing initiatives, whilst they're of clinical benefit to patients and obviously the right way forward, do actually have a negative impact on contractor funding because effectively it drives down prescription volume. We've also got the other de-prescribing initiatives which have been initiated by NHS England. And the problem, of course, arises if you get some surgeries which are actually doing better than average. That can mean that whilst the national mechanism basically adjusts for fees and margin to ensure that overall contractors don't actually lose out, dependent on how active a particular practice or a medicines management team is in trying to manage its drug budget, the contractors in its area may be disadvantaged to the average. And currently, the mechanism as it stands does not cater for that.
Thank you, Garry.
Can I just, as well, sorry, Leyla, just one last thing I just wanted to add there, Garry. I know that there's been quite a few comments around branded generic prescribing. We know that it's a really big issue, and it will be covered in the next webinar around why am I not making enough margin and understanding margin delivery. So we will go into a bit more detail as to how branded generics affect margin delivery and overall community pharmacy funding, and why it's quite a dangerous practice, and some practical tips on what potentially members could do to try and reduce that type of behaviour locally.
Yeah, I think it's also worth mentioning when we actually do the webinar, one of the areas that we need to touch on is to demonstrate why that practice in the round does cost taxpayers money. It doesn't actually save it. But it's a complicated issue and we could touch on it later.
One of the questions that we've got as well is that you're talking about average item value. How is this calculated?
Average item value is your total of count divided by the number of items dispensed. I'm looking at an FB34C here. So what you're effectively looking at is what we call the total of account, which includes all your drug and appliance costs, fees, etc., and that'll actually give you and then obviously divide by the number of items you've actually dispensed, and that gives you the AIV. In actual fact, the BSA does also do it for you. If you look under prescription data on page 2 of an FP34, you can actually see there's an AIV figure that's calculated.
That's great. And what could influence the average item value, Garry?
Well, it's something we call mix, which is, in loose terms, is the mix of different products which are actually prescribed. For example, a contractor with a brand generic mix which is skewed towards brands which tend to be more expensive than generics overall will tend to have a higher item value and therefore a lower margin. A contractor with a very low item value will have a relatively high margin because a large proportion of the fee income is actually fixed by reference to the drug cost, and so it tends to drive margin up. But at the same time, a contractor with a high margin might have a relatively low AIV because most of the drugs they dispense are actually generics. And again, it is a limitation of the current system because it means that some contractors in areas where there's still significant amount of branded prescribing going on will actually be not earning as much margin as some of the colleagues in areas where it's almost 100% generic.
It's also important as well, Garry, so if I can just come in there, the other big thing that can impact AIV is the amount of expensive items that you dispense. So again, it does come back down to that mix. But if you, and I think one of the common things that we see, if you've got a particular patient that's on a lot of expensive, potentially end-of-life drugs, and so you've been supplying them for a few months and they unfortunately pass away and you lose the income from those expensive drugs, that will hit that AIV considerably. And I think people don't necessarily monitor those expensive items and what they're putting, what they're claiming for in a month and what's coming back. And that obviously is given as a summary in the statement at the end as a list. But it is important to look at if you have a drop in AIV and you can't attribute it to anything else, have a look at your expensive items. Is there a particular patient that comes to you every month and hasn't for whatever reason, and where have they gone? And these are the kinds of questions practically that you can start to apply within your business to understand the impact on AIV.
Yeah, can I just add to that? The schedule itself, I think it's on page 3 of some of them, you will actually see a summary of expensive items, which actually tells you the total number of items that you've dispensed to over £100, for example, and it'll give you a total basic price. And what you can actually do is you can get an FP34 and compare it month to month. And so fluctuations in AIV, the first thing you should do is to actually check the number of expensive items, and you can actually work out the average value and the impact that they actually have on your overall item value by getting the total basic price and dividing it by the number of items you've dispensed in that particular month. And that gives you a feel for the contribution of expensive items to your total AIV.
Right. So the next question is, why do we get a clawback on total drug costs dependent on gross drug costs, but on branded goods, we don't get any 8 to 10% discount? Does this not affect our purchase profits?
Well, the margin that's actually earned on brands in reality is generally negative. And the reason for that is because the actual discount rebates with the advent of direct-to-pharmacy solar schemes and what have you, generally average discounts could be as low as 4 or 5% for some contractors, but yet the average discount clawback that's removed from contractors on a monthly basis, on the basis of their total drug costs in that particular month, it can sometimes be the order of 10 or 11%. Now, when we actually conduct the margin survey, these figures are taken into account. So the loss on brands is actually is calculated and is an element of calculating the total margin delivered. So in simple terms, if the margin on brands is, say, negative, it means that we can earn more generic margin in order to offset that loss.
That's great. Thank you. So one last question, Gary. And by the way, audience, we're going to be responding to all the questions that you're sending through, and we're going to post them on the MPA website. And all of you who've logged in will get all these webinar slides and the responses coming your way via email anyway. So if you haven't responded to a question tonight, you will get the response sent to you later on and uploaded on the MPA website. So one last question, Gary. How does the global sum reach each year between PSNC and the Department of Health?
How is the global sum agreed
Yeah.
well, yeah, obviously, in 1 year just recently, unfortunately, it wasn't agreed. It was imposed by the Department of Health, and that resulted in a reduction in the global sum to the tune of 208 million. Since then, there has been no increase. The 2.592 billion global sum we've got at the moment is effectively the 2.8 billion that it was, less to 208 million. So, and obviously at the moment, negotiations are ongoing with PSNC and the Department of Health to see what we can do about ensuring that contractors get some relief from the current difficulties, because obviously the baseline has been cut by 208 million, and the current problems in the procurement market are obviously adding to that pain. So it's not a case of whether or not PSNC agrees with anything at the moment. Obviously, we are in a scenario at the moment, whether we like it or not, is that we've actually got a monopoly payer, right? So, everybody needs to understand that all the cards rest with the Department of Health, and nobody wants a rerun of what happened in 2015, least of all PSNC.
Thank you very much, Gary, and thank you for your presentation. So the topics that we gave you was just proposed topics, and the timings that we gave you is also proposed timing. So if you have any suggestions or if you have any feedback, please do get in touch and let us know what it is that you would like to hear. You can get in touch via contacting the Pharmacy Services Department on the contact details below on the slide. Speak to myself or contact webinar@mpa.co.uk. Thank you very much for tuning in, and keep your questions coming to us, and we'll respond to them as soon as we can. And I look forward to be with you for the next upcoming webinars. So have a good evening, and thank you very much.